Yeah, so originally I studied pharmacology at university, and that's trying to understand how drugs work in the body. I then specialised in psychopharmacology, which is specifically looking at how drugs work in the brain and how they change behaviour, but also used in the treatment of particular psychiatric disorders. And through that, I began to specialise in controlled drugs, so illegal drugs. So my PhD looked at the drug MDMA, looking at the effects of MDMA in the brain. But after my PhD, I began to specialise more in the area of public health, so looking at the real world, so to speak, and the issues that drugs cause for some people, some drugs cause for some people. So over the last few years, my research has focused on drugs policy. So this includes the law, but also what kind of interventions and support are available. And I also specialise in young people's drug use, so trying to understand why people use drugs, their experiences, some of the harms, how we might reduce some of those harms, and how we might support younger people who are using drugs, but who might also have additional challenges and vulnerabilities in their life, such as mental health issues, exploitation, involvement in crime, things like that.
So you would say that it's a cause close to your heart now more than it was when you began your career?
I've always been interested in drugs. So I studied pharmacology because I was fascinated by the fact that almost minute concentrations of chemicals could fundamentally change behaviour, how we think and feel about the world. But then I was interested more in public health because how we respond to drugs, harms and issues is such a cross-cutting discipline. So it's not just healthcare, it's not just social care, it's not just psychiatry. It covers all of these issues because drug use is a topic which can impact many areas of life. It's important to understand jobs, housing, employment, people's relationships, issues around stigma. It's a real cross-cutting and really interesting area, I think.
The word drugs being a blanket term, as I put it in my notes, for a vast variety of issues and subtopics. What is your overall opinion, generally speaking, on drugs? Is it something that we should fear? Is it something that we should harness the power of? Or
that's a big question. So in terms of drugs, that could be equally applied to other chemical substances that we use, alcohol and tobacco, which are drugs, of course. Mm-hmm. Some medicines, when we use them in ways that aren't prescribed, can also be described as drugs. But when we think about drugs, beyond just thinking about pharmacology and toxicology, that also encapsulates social attitudes. Some drugs are normalised, some drugs are more accepted than others. Alcohol is an example here. But often the word drugs itself can evoke fear and sometimes can evoke images of who might be using drugs. And we have different images and different perceptions of different drugs and different groups of people. So when we think about drugs, we might also think about drugs problems, but it's important to note that there's many types of drug problem. So the issues related to drugs are not necessarily the same. Many people, of course, will use drugs without experiencing any harm whatsoever. In fact, that is the normal experience. So most people will mature out of their drug use in their 20s, early 30s, and not experience any harms. That doesn't mean we shouldn't support those individuals to try and reduce the risk of those harms, because there might be risky and harmful use episodes. But I think most attention should be placed on that smaller group of individuals who are experiencing difficulties and issues around drug use. And for many of those members of those populations and communities, drug use is often the most obvious and clearest manifestation of a set of underlying issues and challenges that they faced quite often from childhood. So yeah, drugs can mean celebration, it can mean problems, it can mean addiction, it can mean something quite mundane. In and of itself, it's a neutral term, it's the meaning we ascribe to it and how we want to apply it to different behaviours and populations, which is important.
So would you say that it's a case of the people who tend to do drugs and steer towards that kind of lifestyle, does that stem from, as you said, early onset sort of trauma, things like that, or is it a case of curiosity, which one is more common?
Yeah, if you ask people why they use drugs, they'll give you a multitude of reasons. It could be curiosity, it could be through social bonding, it could be perceptual changes, it might be through treatment and healing and coping with mental ill health. And they're the typical reasons given. Most people take drugs because they like the effects. They take them for so-called recreational purposes, but that might also include social bonding, a sense of individual and group identity. And that's the typical pattern of drug use. And again, that's not to suggest that those people might not experience harms, but it's a pretty unexceptional experience to a large extent, at least to other people. To those individuals, it might be very meaningful. There's a smaller proportion of people who experience most drug-related harm. They're smaller in number, so around about 10% of people who regularly use drugs will go on to experience harms that require formal intervention. Now, it's that group that we often think about or hear about when we hear the term drug user or drug addiction. Now, people develop problems with drugs for many different reasons, but if you do look into biographies and challenges that people face, talk to people in drug treatment, there's very many commonalities. Often, but not always, experiences of childhood adversity. And often these are intergenerational cycles of adversity. So people talk about their family environments, their parents, who they themselves in their own childhood face particular issues, and the cycle continues. So we need to try and disrupt that. There's other people who have untreated or undertreated mental health issues. We know there's a crisis in mental health. People can't access high quality treatment. And those that do access treatment, if they're also using drugs, they often have a poorer quality of care. There's a wider issue of societal and public stigma towards people who are developing problems with drugs, excludes people and marginalises people. Drug use can be very much tied up with issues of homelessness, offending behaviour as well, involvement in the criminal justice system. That's still a minority, but because the impacts of those sorts of behaviours are so visible and so large, that can have a disproportionate impact on how the general public views those people. And that often leads to the perception that people who use drugs are dangerous. So there's, it's important to note that there's as many different reasons and experiences of drug use as there are for other types of experience and behaviour. It's not a clear set of issues and determinants.
Would you say that there are points, certain visible sort of factors, events, things that can happen that people sort of partake in, behaviours that they exhibit? When does it become a problem? When does going to university and taking recreational drugs for the first time, when does it become an issue?
Yeah, so if we look at what we call natural cycles of drug use, so in general, if you took an average person in the UK, and there'll be exceptions to this, they would start using drugs typically around age of 14 and 15. If that individual decides to use drugs, we need to keep in mind that most people don't use drugs. Use will then probably fluctuate, remain stable up until late adolescence. Then there's inflections, particular turning points, sometimes call them, and this is often associated with life changes, independence, so going to universities, going to college, leaving the family home. That can lead to an escalation in drug use to those people who've already started using. And indeed, many people who go to university use drugs for the first time at university. As those people age, they might continue to use drugs. The typical pattern is pretty infrequent, to be honest. People have periods of more or less frequent drug use. But on average, if you look at a drug like ecstasy or cocaine, typically people are going to be using that once or twice a year. That's not a lot. That's the majority of cases of drug use. And again, people tend to mature out of drug use as they get a job, have a family, etc. Now, of course, there's always people who maintain and can control their drug use as they age into adulthood. This usually is because they can draw upon what we call additional forms of capital. And that might relate to economic capital, so a job, a house, firm social relationships, and drug use is only part of that. But within this group, sometimes there might be an escalation of drug use, that there's a narrowing of social activity and a narrowing of identity around the drug use. So people might be spending more time accessing, using and recovering from the effects of drug use. and their sense of their social behaviours, where they socialise, who they socialise with, might narrow around drug use. So that can lead to an escalation in use and problems. And we often see that in relation to cocaine powder, for example. It becomes a common ritual, so that monthly use or a few times a year use suddenly becomes a bit more regular. You hang out with people who are also using cocaine. You're using cocaine to help you to drink, to help you to party. That can become an issue, and people need support around that. Now, that is probably a slightly different trajectory than the types of drug use that we see when people develop problems with, say, heroin or crack cocaine, the more problematic use of drugs. Again, it's important not to generalise, but in those populations we tend to see quite an early initiation of drug use. And that might not be heroin or crack cocaine, that often comes a bit later, but we often see perhaps more regular patterns of use in early teens. And that drug use might be mixed up with other life challenges as well. And those individuals might have other experiences, biographical challenges, which mean that they're more likely to experience harms from drug use, and they might be more likely to come to the attention of services as well. And this can escalate even further if those wider issues are not addressed. And so what we do find is that whereas young people who go on to develop more serious drug problems in adulthood, they often come to the attention of services and organisations and charities in mid to late adolescence. But if their drug use and other behaviours aren't addressed, they kind of disappear, they vanish. Services lose track of them, they become 18, and then they move out of young people's services. And it's often during this period where the drug use might escalate. And this is where, for example, initiation of heroin or other drugs such as crack cocaine might occur. And this is often much more likely, again, if they face other life challenges. And this might be compounded by a lack of social connections, a lack of this social capital that I mentioned. It's much more likely in people who perhaps have issues around mental health, a higher risk of homelessness, don't have regular employment, and all of these things compound together. And so this can actually lead to quite a rapid escalation of harms associated with their drugs.
Would you say that there is benefits to it? I think you touched on a little bit about social sort of, protocol and things like that, but yeah, so would you say that there is a benefit to it? Yeah,
so it's important to recognise both the benefits and costs of all types of health behaviour, including drug use. Drug use must have benefits for people who take them, otherwise they wouldn't use them. People don't take drugs to become addicted and to overdose and to lose their jobs. That happens to some people. That's not why people use them.
Not the motivation for it.
Yeah, of course not. I'm oversimplifying things, but people take drugs because it makes them feel good. They might be using it for spiritual, psychotherapeutic practices, to form bonds, to enjoy music, whatever, all of those things. And we have enough evidence to say that they are common experiences. Traditionally, when we've done research, and I don't just mean myself, I mean academics, doctors, etc., we've tended to focus on the harms of drug use for many reasons. One, because of the legislation and policy. So we have drug controls, which indicates that as a society we don't approve of drug use, although we might have individual differences in our views. But also as well, typically medical and health research, because we know that drug use can be associated with problems, we need to be prepared for that in terms of services and understanding. What we've seen over the last decade, maybe the last 15 years or so, is a revitalisation of research which was undertaken in the mid-20th century, particularly in relation to psychedelics and around the potential utility of psychedelics. So when, for example, LSD was first discovered and first studied in the 1940s, it was very much not as a recreational drug or as a spiritual compound, but as an aid for psychotherapy and psychiatry, trying to address some of the big serious mental issues and the lack of treatments at the time. And similarly with cannabis, Of course, the history of cannabis and the medical utility of cannabis goes back centuries in many countries. And that tradition has continued in many countries, but in the United Kingdom, it's perhaps more of a recent interest in this. Certainly, I would say over the last decade in terms of popular consciousness and popular awareness of this. But again, I think that relates to the fact that drugs are complex, there's harms, there's benefits. Some of those benefits might be in terms of social behaviours, individual benefits, but then there's also potentially medical benefits in terms of therapies and treatments. And it's quite interesting to reflect that historically, so before the 20th century, when we would think about drugs and some of the applications of drugs like opium or cannabis or even things like cocaine, we often didn't distinguish between the euphoric and positive effects and the medical effects. They were all part and parcel of the same thing. It only really began with the rise of the professionalisation of medics and doctors and psychiatrists that we suddenly thought of as drugs almost exclusively as a negative compound and negative sets of behaviours.
The war on drugs.
The war on drugs, which I think has largely been overstated in the United Kingdom, but I understand where that's coming from. But I think things have largely come full circle
in the US.
Things have come full circle in terms of a greater awareness and acceptance that some of these compounds, which have been demonised as drugs in inverted commas, might also have other uses. Some commentators argue that perhaps that might go too far, and actually a focus on the medicalisation might actually ignore some of those lower key social and personal benefits that people might have. And some commentators have argued that as legislation might change to support medical utility of cannabis and psychedelics, for example, what does this mean about other types of use? That's an issue which has been addressed to a certain extent in legally regulated cannabis markets, so in North America, some countries in Europe, for example. But increasingly there's discussions around psychedelics, for example, about how individuals might have benefits that are not solely medical benefits.